They came with fake badges and a tow hook, thinking they could take his tractor. But the ground shook with engines, and when military trucks rolled in, their courage collapsed. I stood in my driveway, watching two men in fake police uniforms attempt to hook my grandfather's vintage John Deere tractor to their tow truck, while Marcus Thompson, our HOA president, stood behind them with the smuggest grin I'd ever seen. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Grove subdivision as I realized this power-hungry maniac had finally crossed a line he could never uncross. My hands trembled with rage as I watched these fraudulent officers Marcus had hired try to steal the one thing that connected me to my late grandfather's memory. The tractor wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was a family heirloom that had been perfectly maintained and legally parked in my own driveway for 3 years without a single complaint. Marcus had been escalating his harassment for months, but hiring fake cops to impersonate law enforcement was a federal crime that would destroy him completely. "Sir, this vehicle violates HOA regulations and must be removed immediately," one of the fake officers announced, his cheap costume badge glinting in the sunlight. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes as he realized this wasn't going to be the easy intimidation job Marcus had promised. The second man fumbled with the tow chains, clearly inexperienced and nervous about the growing crowd of neighbors emerging from their houses. Marcus stepped forward with his clipboard, waving some fabricated violation notice he'd probably typed up that morning. His thin frame practically vibrated with excitement as he prepared to humiliate me in front of the entire neighborhood. "Mr. Johnson, you've had plenty of warnings about this eyesore," he declared, his nasal voice carrying across the quiet street. What Marcus didn't know was that my brother Jake was currently deployed with the National Guard just 20 minutes away at Fort Morrison, and I had already texted him about this situation. Jake commanded a motor pool division and had access to military vehicles that would make Marcus's little power play look like a children's game. I smiled quietly to myself as I heard the distant rumble of diesel engines approaching our subdivision. Marcus was about to learn that some battles you simply cannot win, and messing with a veteran's family was the worst mistake of his miserable life. The fake cops were already looking nervous as neighbors began recording the entire incident on their phones. I pulled out my phone and started my own recording, knowing that every second of this encounter would become evidence in the federal case that would end Marcus's reign of terror forever. "Marcus, are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with this?" I asked calmly, giving him one last chance to retreat before my brother arrived with enough military hardware to level Small City. His arrogant laugh echoed through the morning air as he gestured for his hired thugs to continue their illegal operation. The ground began to vibrate slightly as the convoy of military vehicles turned onto our street, and I could see the color draining from the fake officers' faces. Marcus remained oblivious, too drunk on his own power to notice that his entire world was about to crumble around him. Have you ever dealt with an HOA president who thought they were above the law? Let me know in the comments, because what happened next will restore your faith in justice. Marcus Thompson had transformed from a mild-mannered accountant into a power-hungry dictator the moment he was elected HOA president 2 years ago. His 5 feet 6 inches frame and thinning gray hair made him look harmless, but his Napoleon complex had turned our peaceful subdivision into a surveillance state where neighbors lived in constant fear of his petty tyranny. He patrolled the streets daily in his white Honda Civic, armed with a clipboard, measuring tape, and an arsenal of violation notices that he distributed like candy on Halloween. Marcus had appointed himself the supreme authority over every aspect of our lives, from the exact shade of beige our mailboxes could be painted to the precise height our grass was allowed to grow. No detail was too small for his obsessive attention, and no resident was safe from his increasingly aggressive enforcement tactics. The harassment had started small, with Marcus issuing warnings about my garbage cans being visible from the street for 30 minutes past the designated pickup time. Then came the fines for my garden hose being coiled clockwise instead of counterclockwise, followed by citations for having visitors park in my driveway for more than 4 hours. Each violation notice came with increasingly threatening language about legal action and potential foreclosure proceedings. Marcus had weaponized the HOA bylaws into instruments of psychological warfare, twisting vague language to justify whatever petty vendetta he felt like pursuing on any given day. He recruited a network of neighborhood spies, mostly consisting of bitter retirees who had nothing better to do than peer through their blinds and report on their neighbors' activities. His campaign against me intensified after I publicly questioned his decision to spend $50,000 of HOA funds on decorative street lamps that nobody wanted or needed. Marcus took my reasonable objection as a personal attack on his authority and declared war on my entire family. He began conducting surprise inspections of my property, claiming he had received anonymous complaints about various imaginary violations. The man would spend hours photographing my house from every angle, measuring distances between objects, and scrutinizing my landscaping with the intensity of a crime scene investigator. His detailed violation reports read like fiction novels, describing how my slightly overgrown bushes were creating a public nuisance and how my children's chalk art on the driveway constituted unauthorized signage. Marcus's power trip reached new heights when he convinced the board to approve a new rule requiring all residents to submit written requests for any outdoor activities, including washing cars, watering plants, or having barbecues. He established quiet hours that lasted from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., effectively banning normal family life in our own homes. The man installed security cameras around the common areas and claimed they were for community safety, but everyone knew he was building a surveillance network to catch residents in minor rule violations. He started showing up at people's houses unannounced, demanding entry to inspect for compliance issues, and threatening legal action when homeowners refused his unreasonable demands. What made Marcus truly dangerous was his absolute belief that he was untouchable and that his position gave him unlimited authority over everyone in the subdivision. He had convinced himself that he was some kind of righteous crusader fighting against chaos and disorder, when in reality, he was just a sad little man drunk on the tiny amount of power he'd been given. Marcus genuinely believed that every resident should bow to his authority without question, and he took any form of resistance as a personal insult that demanded swift and severe retaliation. This delusional mindset would ultimately lead him to make the catastrophic mistake that would destroy everything he had built and land him in federal prison. The situation reached a breaking point when Marcus discovered that my grandfather's vintage 1952 John Deere tractor was classified as an unauthorized recreational vehicle under an obscure bylaw he had recently amended without proper community input. This wasn't just any tractor. It was a family heirloom that my grandfather had restored by hand over 30 years, and it held immense sentimental value as the centerpiece of my memories with him. The tractor was perfectly maintained, registered, and legally parked in my own driveway, where it had sat without incident for 3 years. Marcus knew exactly what this machine meant to my family, which made his decision to target it especially cruel and calculated. He spent weeks researching legal loopholes and technicalities, desperately searching for any way to force me to remove the tractor from my property. When Marcus couldn't find legitimate grounds for his demands, he decided to manufacture a crisis by hiring 2 men to pose as law enforcement officers and intimidate me into compliance. These weren't real police officers. They were ex-security guards Marcus had found through some shady online service, complete with fake badges and uniforms purchased from a costume shop. The plan was to create enough fear and confusion that I would voluntarily surrender my property rather than face what appeared to be legal consequences. Marcus genuinely believed his scheme was foolproof and that I would be too intimidated to question the authority of uniformed officers demanding compliance with his fabricated violation notice. He had become so drunk on his own power that he thought he could literally hire fake law enforcement to do his bidding. What Marcus didn't realize was that impersonating police officers is a serious federal crime that carries mandatory prison time. And by orchestrating this scheme, he had committed multiple felonies including conspiracy, fraud, and intimidation under color of authority. His arrogance had blinded him to the massive legal exposure he was creating for himself and his hired accomplices. The fake officers themselves seemed nervous about the operation, but Marcus had convinced them it was just a civil matter, and that their uniforms were merely official HOA enforcement attire. He had paid them $500 each to show up and create an intimidating presence while he served his violation notice, never explaining that they would be committing federal crimes by impersonating law enforcement officers. The morning of the incident, Marcus was practically vibrating with excitement as he watched his hired thugs attempt to tow my grandfather's tractor. He stood behind them like a general commanding his troops, clipboard in hand, barking orders and directing the operation with the smugness of someone who believed he had finally won our ongoing battle. Marcus had invited several of his loyal supporters to witness what he called the restoration of order and compliance in our community. He wanted this to be a public spectacle that would intimidate other residents and demonstrate the consequences of challenging his authority. The man was so focused on his moment of triumph that he completely missed the approaching sound of diesel engines and the growing crowd of concerned neighbors. Marcus's fatal error wasn't just hiring fake cops. It was underestimating who he was dealing with and failing to research his target before launching such an aggressive attack. He knew I was a veteran, but he had no idea that my brother Jake was currently stationed at Fort Morrison with the National Guard, commanding a motor pool full of military vehicles and a squad of soldiers who considered family loyalty a sacred duty. Marcus thought he was intimidating a powerless homeowner, but he was actually poking a sleeping bear with connections to enough military firepower to flatten his entire subdivision. His arrogance and complete lack of strategic thinking were about to transform his moment of triumph into the most humiliating defeat of his miserable life. While Marcus was busy plotting his elaborate tractor theft scheme, I had been quietly documenting every single one of his illegal activities and building an ironclad case that would eventually destroy him completely. My military training had taught me the importance of patience, strategic planning, and gathering overwhelming evidence before striking back against an enemy. I knew that Marcus's escalating harassment was eventually going to cross into criminal territory, so I had been preparing for this moment for months. Every violation notice, every threatening phone call, every surprise inspection had been carefully recorded and cataloged in a comprehensive file that would make any prosecutor's job incredibly easy. I had installed discrete security cameras around my property after Marcus's first surprise inspection, capturing hours of footage showing him trespassing, peering through windows, and conducting unauthorized surveillance of my family. What Marcus didn't know was that I had been quietly building alliances with other residents who had suffered under his tyrannical rule, and many of them were eager to share their own documentation of his abusive behavior. Mrs. Henderson's son David had provided security footage showing Marcus tampering with their mailbox to create a violation. Tom Rodriguez had recorded phone conversations where Marcus threatened to have his family evicted if he didn't pay excessive fines for imaginary infractions. Even some of Marcus's former supporters had begun to turn against him as his behavior became increasingly erratic and threatening. I had been serving as an unofficial coordinator for this growing resistance movement, helping neighbors understand their legal rights and documenting patterns of harassment that would prove invaluable in court proceedings. My secret weapon wasn't just evidence. It was my family connections and military background that Marcus had foolishly overlooked in his arrogance. My brother Jake commanded a motor pool division at Fort Morrison, just 20 minutes away from our subdivision, and he had access to military vehicles and personnel that could respond to emergency situations involving veterans and their families. Jake had been following Marcus's harassment campaign through my regular updates, and he was already planning contingency responses for various escalation scenarios. My younger brother Mike worked as a paralegal at the district attorney's office and had been providing legal guidance on how to properly document criminal harassment and prepare evidence for prosecution. My cousin Steve was a detective with the county sheriff's department who had offered to investigate Marcus's activities if they crossed into clearly criminal territory. The most damaging evidence I had collected was financial records showing Marcus's systematic embezzlement of HOA funds for personal use, including the fake police operation he had funded with community money. Through careful analysis of HOA financial statements and receipts I had obtained through public records requests, I had uncovered a pattern of fraudulent expenses and unauthorized spending that totaled over $75,000. Marcus had been using HOA funds to pay for his personal legal fees, his surveillance equipment, and even the fake police officers he had hired to intimidate residents. This financial fraud alone was enough to send him to prison for several years. But combined with his impersonation scheme, it would result in federal charges that would destroy his life completely. I had also been secretly recording Marcus's increasingly threatening phone calls and documenting his pattern of escalating harassment against multiple families in the subdivision. His threats had become more explicit over time, including promises to make life unbearable for anyone who opposed his authority and vows to use any means necessary to maintain control over the community. These recordings would prove criminal intent and show that his fake police operation wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of illegal intimidation tactics. I knew that when the moment came to strike back, I would have enough evidence to ensure Marcus faced serious federal charges that would result in significant prison time and complete financial ruin. The only question was when he would make the fatal mistake that would trigger his total destruction. And that morning, watching fake cops try to steal my grandfather's tractor, I knew that moment had finally arrived. The rumble of diesel engines grew louder as my brother Jake's convoy rounded the corner onto Maple Street, and I watched Marcus's confident expression slowly transform into confusion and then pure terror. Leading the convoy was Jake himself in a massive M35A3 military cargo truck, followed by two Humvees and an armored personnel carrier that looked like it could drive through a brick wall without slowing down. The entire convoy was perfectly legal. Jake had obtained permission for a community outreach demonstration that just happened to coincide with Marcus's illegal towing operation. The fake police officers took one look at the approaching military vehicles and immediately began disconnecting their equipment from my tractor, realizing they had walked into a situation far beyond their pay grade. Marcus stood frozen in my driveway, clutching his clipboard like a security blanket as the full scope of his miscalculation became apparent to everyone watching. Jake parked the lead truck directly behind the tow vehicle, effectively trapping Marcus's hired thugs and creating a perimeter that would prevent anyone from leaving until law enforcement arrived. 6 uniformed National Guard soldiers emerged from the vehicles, not to threaten or intimidate, but simply to observe and document what they had been told was a possible case of impersonation of federal officers. The contrast was stunning. Real soldiers in authentic uniforms standing next to fake cops in costume shop badges, with Marcus caught between them like a deer in headlights. Jake approached with calm military bearing, introducing himself to the fake officers and politely asking to see their credentials and authority for conducting law enforcement activities in his jurisdiction. The nervous fake cops began stuttering explanations about HOA enforcement, while desperately looking to Marcus for guidance that never came. I pulled out my phone and began broadcasting the entire confrontation live on social media, narrating the scene for viewers who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. This is Marcus Thompson, our HOA president, who hired fake police officers to steal my grandfather's vintage tractor, I announced to the rapidly growing online audience. The video immediately began gaining traction as neighbors shared it across community groups and social media platforms, spreading Marcus's humiliation far beyond our small subdivision. Within minutes, hundreds of people were watching Marcus's empire crumble in real time, commenting and sharing the footage as it documented his complete destruction. Local news stations began reaching out for interviews, sensing a viral story about HOA corruption and fake police officers that would capture public attention. Marcus finally found his voice and began screaming about his authority as HOA president, demanding that the military personnel leave his community immediately and stop interfering with official HOA business. His shrill demands only made the situation more embarrassing as Jake calmly explained that impersonating law enforcement officers was a federal crime and that real authorities had been contacted to investigate the situation. The fake cops were frantically trying to remove their badges and distance themselves from Marcus, claiming they had been told this was a civil matter and that they weren't trying to impersonate real officers. Their obvious panic and desperate attempts to escape responsibility only provided more evidence of their guilt and Marcus's criminal conspiracy. The crowd of neighbors that had gathered to watch the spectacle began openly laughing at Marcus as his carefully constructed image of authority collapsed completely. People who had been terrorized by his harassment campaigns were now seeing him revealed as a pathetic fraud who had hired costume shop cops to intimidate his neighbors. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Hey Marcus, where did you buy those police officers? The Halloween store?" And the laughter grew louder. Marcus's face turned bright red as he realized that every person in the neighborhood was now witnessing his ultimate humiliation, and that this footage would be preserved forever as evidence of his spectacular failure. The man who had spent 2 years terrorizing residents with threats of legal action was now facing real legal consequences that would destroy everything he had built, and everyone could see the exact moment when he realized his reign of terror was over forever. The sound of approaching sirens announced the arrival of real law enforcement officers, and I watched Marcus's face go completely white as he realized that his fake police operation had attracted the attention of actual federal authorities. The FBI had been contacted about the impersonation incident, and they took crimes involving fake federal officers very seriously, especially when combined with fraud and extortion charges. Agent Sarah Mitchell emerged from the lead vehicle and immediately took control of the scene, separating Marcus from his hired accomplices and beginning individual interviews that would establish the full scope of his criminal conspiracy. The fake officers immediately began trying to negotiate plea deals, offering to testify against Marcus in exchange for reduced sentences, which told everyone exactly who the real mastermind behind this operation had been. Marcus's arrogance finally cracked as Agent Mitchell read him his rights and explained the federal charges he was facing, including conspiracy to impersonate law enforcement officers, wire fraud, extortion, and embezzlement of community funds. Each charge carried significant prison time, and when combined together, they virtually guaranteed that Marcus would spend the next decade behind bars. His demands to call his lawyer were met with cold professionalism as agents explained that he would have that opportunity after he was processed at the federal courthouse. The man who had terrorized our neighborhood for 2 years was now being led away in handcuffs, his clipboard and fake authority stripped away to reveal the pathetic criminal he had always been. The investigation that followed Marcus's arrest uncovered even more criminal activity than anyone had suspected, as federal agents seized his computer and financial records to build their case. They discovered that Marcus had been embezzling HOA funds for over 18 months, using community money to pay for his surveillance equipment, legal fees, and various harassment campaigns against residents who opposed his authority. The fake police operation alone had cost the HOA $3,000, but his total theft exceeded $100,000 when all the fraudulent expenses were calculated. Bank records showed that Marcus had been living well beyond his means, funding a lifestyle of petty tyranny with money stolen from the very neighbors he claimed to be protecting. Local and national media picked up the story of the HOA president who hired fake cops to steal a veteran's family tractor, and Marcus became a nationwide symbol of HOA corruption and abuse of power. The footage of his arrest went viral across social media platforms, generating millions of views and spawning countless memes about his spectacular downfall. News interviews with residents revealed the full extent of his harassment campaigns, and Marcus was publicly exposed as a criminal who had terrorized families and stolen from his community. His mugshot became an internet sensation, with people sharing it as an example of what happens when petty tyrants get too drunk on their own power. The financial consequences were just as devastating as the criminal charges, as Marcus faced massive civil lawsuits from residents he had harassed and the HOA itself seeking to recover the funds he had stolen. His house went into foreclosure within 3 months of his arrest, as legal fees and restitution payments consumed his entire savings and forced him to declare bankruptcy. The man who had once threatened others with eviction and foreclosure now lost everything he owned, including his reputation, his freedom, and any possibility of ever holding a position of authority again. Marcus's wife divorced him during the trial proceedings, taking their children and moving to another state to escape the national humiliation he had brought upon their family. The ultimate irony was that Marcus, who had spent years threatening others with legal consequences, now faced real justice that would follow him for the rest of his life. With Marcus behind bars, serving an 8-year federal sentence, our subdivision underwent a complete transformation that restored the peace and community spirit he had systematically destroyed during his reign of terror. The emergency HOA board meeting held after his arrest was the most well-attended community gathering in the neighborhood's history, as residents came together to rebuild the association from the ground up. We elected a new board of reasonable neighbors who immediately began reversing Marcus's ridiculous rules and policies, focusing on genuine community improvement rather than petty control and harassment. The surveillance cameras were removed, the excessive fines were canceled, and the bylaws were rewritten to prevent any future tyrant from accumulating the kind of unchecked power that Marcus had abused so spectacularly. My grandfather's vintage John Deere tractor became something of a neighborhood celebrity, with visitors coming by regularly to see the machine that had triggered Marcus's downfall and ultimate imprisonment. I decided to start it up every Sunday morning at exactly the time Marcus used to begin his patrol rounds, and the sound of that old engine running became a weekly celebration of our freedom from his tyranny. The tractor that Marcus had tried to steal was now a symbol of resistance against HOA corruption and a reminder that bullies eventually face consequences for their actions. Local car shows began featuring the tractor as a special exhibit, with signs explaining how it helped bring down a corrupt HOA president and restore justice to a terrorized community. Jake's military convoy became legendary in our area, and the story of how National Guard soldiers helped expose fake police officers spread throughout veteran communities across the country. The video footage of Marcus's arrest continued generating millions of views online, inspiring other HOA victims to stand up against corrupt board members and document their own harassment experiences. Jake was commended by his commanding officers for his professional handling of the situation and his role in exposing federal crimes, and he became a popular speaker at veteran events discussing community service and standing up for family. The military vehicles that had terrified Marcus's fake cops were now welcome guests at neighborhood barbecues and community celebrations. The federal investigation into Marcus's crimes led to broader reforms in HOA oversight and accountability, as legislators recognized the need for better protection against the kind of systematic abuse Marcus had perpetrated. New laws were passed requiring financial audits of HOA boards and establishing clear procedures for residents to report harassment and corruption without fear of retaliation. Marcus's case became a textbook example in law schools studying white-collar crime and abuse of power, ensuring that his humiliation would educate future lawyers and prosecutors about the importance of protecting citizens from petty tyrants. His mugshot appeared in legal textbooks alongside other famous cases of corruption and fraud. Every morning when I looked out my window and saw my grandfather's tractor sitting peacefully in the driveway where it belonged, I smiled knowing that justice had prevailed and that Marcus would spend years reflecting on his crimes from behind prison bars. The neighborhood kids had started calling it the Freedom Tractor, and I often found them playing around it and asking to hear the story of how it helped defeat the mean HOA president. My family had gone from being targets of harassment to local heroes who had helped liberate an entire community from corruption and abuse. The quiet satisfaction of watching Marcus's empire crumble and knowing that he would never again terrorize innocent families made every peaceful morning a celebration of justice served. Our subdivision had learned valuable lessons about the importance of community solidarity and the power of standing up to bullies, no matter how much fake authority they claim to possess. 5 years have passed since Marcus's arrest and imprisonment, and our Maple Grove subdivision has become a model community that other neighborhoods look to for examples of positive HOA governance and resident cooperation. The dramatic story of the fake police officers and the military convoy has become local legend, told and retold at community gatherings as a reminder of how quickly things can change when good people refuse to accept corruption and abuse. Children who were too young to remember Marcus's reign of terror now grow up in a neighborhood where creativity and individual expression are celebrated rather than punished, where neighbors help each other instead of spying and reporting violations. The transformation has been so complete that newcomers to the area often don't believe the stories about how different things used to be under Marcus's tyrannical leadership. My grandfather's vintage tractor has become the unofficial mascot of our community, featured prominently in neighborhood newsletters and serving as the centerpiece of our annual freedom celebration held every year on the anniversary of Marcus's arrest. Local schools bring students by to see the famous tractor and hear the story of how ordinary citizens can stand up against corruption and win justice through proper documentation and legal channels. The tractor still runs perfectly after all these years, and I fire it up regularly to maintain its mechanical condition and to remind everyone of the importance of preserving family heritage against those who would destroy it for petty political gain. Jake retired from the National Guard with full honors and now works as a community liaison, helping other neighborhoods deal with HOA corruption and abuse of power cases. His experience with Marcus's case made him an expert in recognizing the warning signs of board member misconduct, and he has helped dozens of communities reform their associations before problems escalate to criminal levels. The military convoy that helped bring down Marcus has become a popular feature at community parades and veteran appreciation events, where Jake tells the story of how soldiers can serve their communities even after their formal military service ends. The legal precedent set by Marcus's prosecution has been cited in dozens of other cases involving HOA corruption across the country, and his name has become synonymous with the dangers of unchecked authority in residential communities. Law enforcement agencies now take HOA harassment complaints much more seriously, and prosecutors have powerful tools to pursue criminal charges against board members who abuse their positions. Marcus himself remains in federal prison, with his earliest possible parole date still 3 years away, serving as a permanent reminder that actions have consequences and that no one is above the law, regardless of their position or perceived authority. Our community learned that the best defense against tyranny is an engaged and informed citizenry willing to document abuses, support each other, and demand accountability from those in positions of power. We established new traditions of transparency and communication that ensure no future board member could accumulate the kind of unchecked authority that Marcus abused so spectacularly. Regular community meetings, financial audits, and open communication channels have created a system of checks and balances that protects everyone's rights while still maintaining reasonable community standards. The neighborhood that Marcus once terrorized with his clipboard and fake authority has become a thriving example of what communities can achieve when they work together with mutual respect and shared purpose. Have you ever had an HOA nightmare story of your own? Share your experiences in the comments below and let others know how you dealt with corrupt board members or harassment campaigns. If you enjoyed this story of justice and revenge against HOA tyranny, subscribe for more tales of how ordinary people can fight back against corruption and win. Remember that documenting everything and building strong community alliances are your best weapons against petty tyrants who think their fake authority makes them untouchable. 10 years after the infamous Tractor Day incident that brought down Marcus Thompson, I received an unexpected letter in my mailbox that would provide the perfect conclusion to our neighborhood's most dramatic chapter. The letter was from Marcus himself, written from his federal prison cell, where he was serving the final months of his sentence before being released on supervised parole. His handwriting was shaky and uncertain, nothing like the bold strokes he used to sign his threatening violation notices back when he terrorized our community with his clipboard and fake authority. The letter contained something I never expected to receive from the man who had made my family's life miserable for 2 years, a genuine apology that revealed how completely his perspective had changed during his time behind bars. Reading his words, I realized that sometimes the greatest victory isn't just defeating your enemy, but watching them finally understand the pain they caused and genuinely regret their actions. Marcus's letter explained how his fellow inmates had initially mocked him for being the fake cop HOA guy, whose arrest video they had seen countless times on prison television and smuggled cell phones. He wrote about the humiliation of being known throughout the federal prison system as the petty tyrant who hired costume shop police officers to steal a veteran's family tractor, and how that reputation had made his early years behind bars particularly difficult. But somewhere during his lengthy sentence, Marcus had undergone genuine rehabilitation and therapy that helped him understand the psychological roots of his need for control and domination over others. He acknowledged that his behavior had been criminal and abusive, and he expressed sincere remorse for the pain he had caused to dozens of families in our neighborhood, especially targeting my grandfather's treasure tractor that held such deep sentimental value. The transformation of our community had become a case study taught in urban planning and community development programs across the country, as academics recognized our neighborhood's journey from tyranny to democracy as a perfect example of grassroots reform in action. Graduate students regularly visited Maple Grove to interview residents and study how we had successfully rebuilt our HOA from the ground up after Marcus's criminal leadership nearly destroyed our community bonds. My grandfather's vintage John Deere tractor had been featured in museum exhibits about American community resilience, and the Smithsonian had even inquired about acquiring it for their collection, documenting significant artifacts of local history and civil rights struggles. The tractor now sits in a place of honor in our community center, surrounded by photographs and documents telling the complete story of our neighborhood's transformation. Jake had parlayed his experience with a Marcus case into a successful consulting business, helping communities across America deal with HOA corruption and abuse of power issues, and he had testified before Congress about the need for federal oversight of residential association governance. His military convoy response had become the gold standard for how veteran communities could support each other against institutional harassment, and the Department of Veterans Affairs now included HOA abuse as a recognized form of harassment that could trigger support services for military families. Jake's business had helped reform over 200 corrupt HOAs nationwide, saving thousands of families from the kind of systematic abuse that Marcus had perpetrated in our neighborhood, and his methods have been adopted by veteran advocacy organizations as standard procedures for dealing with civilian authority abuse. Perhaps the most satisfying development was learning that our victory had inspired federal legislation known as the Marcus Thompson HOA Reform Act, which established strict oversight procedures for residential associations and created criminal penalties for board members who abuse their authority to harass residents or embezzle community funds. The law required background checks for HOA board candidates, mandatory financial audits, and clear procedures for residents to report abuse without fear of retaliation. All reforms that could have prevented Marcus's reign of terror if they had existed when he first began his harassment campaigns. Every time a corrupt HOA board member is arrested under this new legislation, prosecutors and media outlets reference Marcus's case as the catalyst that made these protections necessary, ensuring that his name remains permanently associated with the consequences of unchecked power and abuse. As I finished reading Marcus's letter and looked out my window at the peaceful neighborhood he had once terrorized, I felt a profound sense of closure knowing that justice had been served, lessons had been learned, and positive change had emerged from our darkest chapter. Our community had not only survived Marcus's tyranny, but had emerged stronger, more united, and better prepared to protect ourselves against future threats to our freedom and dignity. The legacy of our victory extended far beyond our small subdivision, inspiring reforms that would protect countless other families from experiencing the harassment and abuse that Marcus had inflicted on us. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying your enemy, but transforming their defeat into something positive that prevents others from suffering the same injustices. And that's exactly what we accomplished in the decade following Marcus's spectacular downfall. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of abuse of authority, harassment, and the powerful dignity of military service. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of standing up for your rights and to inspire a deeper appreciation for those who serve and protect our country.